Bueno, muchas gracias a todos los ponentes para esta interesante ponencia. Si hay preguntas, dudas, observaciones, aquí estamos, 20 minutos, 20 minutos.
A las 8:30 nos echan. O sea.
Nos echamos entonces, tenemos tiempo, ¿no?
Sí, del edificio. Sí. ¿Paras?
One question about the kind of time frame, a little bit of what you are saying, because I have a feeling that, of course, the reaction to Wilsonianism was also a reaction to that. So. Yeah, so it's a question to José Manuel about the temporality of the relationship between the Wilsonian moment, if you want, and the Leninian moment, yes? Because it seems to me that it's hard to tell this story without taking into account that a year before Wilson, there is another appeal to self-determination, which is actually relatively successful, and which gives a certain kind of agenda for the radical left in different countries of the peripheries of Europe to kind of pick up this discourse. And then it's very interesting that the Wilsonian framework is giving a similar legitimization for non-radical leftist groups. I mean, and that I think has to be somehow put into your model of how these two, I mean, to what extent Wilson is actually a reaction to something else. And to Stefan, I just wanted to raise the question of, still, I mean, I understand that the macro narrative is very much what you are saying, but I had a feeling that there are still quite interesting, let's say, figures and intellectual streams that don't fit, and that would be still the comparativist trends. I mean, I'm thinking about, you know, like in Hungary, Hajnal, but then basically this you can find in every context. Yes, and it's very interesting that it's not true that they are kind of anti-nationalist, but nevertheless the epistemology that they build is quite different than this kind of national liberal narrative. And then after 1945, or in some cases during the war, actually they develop a certain kind of alternative epistemology which will generate basically the post-war non-national historiography in many contexts. So I would be interested in how do you put them into your model. And then just a short remark to Miguel. I mean, I think I kind of recognize what you are saying from my East Central European perspective, but I had a feeling that what is a little bit missing is that, I mean, you have plural models even within the peasantist or agrarian populist movements. I mean, like in most of the countries, like in Poland, you have 4 peasantist movements, and they have all completely different relationship to the national question. The Galician ones, actually, like the Win-20 movement is actually nationalistic. The former Russian imperial peasantists are very anti-nationalist and so on, and then one is actually incorporating even the Ukrainians. So I would be very careful to kind of create a model with. And also there is, I think, a temporal shift that in the early 20s, peasantist movements tend to be quite leftist. In the mid-20s, they become some sort of kind of more liberal. And in the 1930s, there is a pluralization or polarization that once again, some of these movements go to the right. In the Czech movement, for example, within the same Czech movement, some of them will become some sort of conservatives, some of them will be almost communists, and so on. And sometimes even the same people are shifting their position. So I think it's very hard to kind of, like Stamboliski, for example, whom you mentioned, was very anti-nationalist and was murdered by Macedonian nationalists. They cut off his hand with which he was signing the agreement about Balkan federalism. Yeah? So I think that wouldn't fit into this kind of model of nation building through peasantism. I mean, it's a quite different model.
Thanks very much to all the speakers. It was massively interesting. I have 2 small questions just as points of information for José Manuel and for Miguel and Pietro. José Manuel, I really very much liked your emphasis on the, if you like, minor nationality activists that were already, you know, organizing and producing discourse and working on public opinion before, in the run-up to Versailles, even before the war. I was wondering to which extent these people were in contact and possibly collaborating with diaspora nationalisms in the US, and to which extent Wilson brought a domestically generated American public opinion to Versailles with him, so that there was a sort of a transatlantic back and forth in that particular moment. For Miguel and Pietro, thanks very much. To put, you know, peasants as an agency rather than as an object of exoticism on the map of national movements is massively helpful. But I was wondering, are these people locked into their localism? We know of industrial workers that they organize internationally. We know of intellectuals that they are in contact internationally. When you have models like a cooperative movement, do these agricultural movements in different countries, federate? Do they have congresses? Do they exchange information? What is the transnational history, as opposed to the national, if you like, the juxtaposed national manifestations of agrarian movements? Thank you.
Let's go.
Yes, thank you very much. I just had, first of all, one quick question to Stefan Berger about the Annales School, which you painted as cosmopolitan and non-ethnic. You could see that perhaps in some works, I mean, thinking of Bloch's work on the King's Touch, for example. But I'm wondering, is it really so cosmopolitan? Could you not say there is actually a very national concern with the Annales School, with the whole emphasis on, I mean, the longue durée, the phrase isn't there yet, but the sort of the implications thereof certainly are the concern with territory, borders, the very fact that Strasbourg is a centre. Is there not rather perhaps a national element to that? And then to Miguel and Lorenzo, I had a question about the debate on national indifference that certainly in the historiography of East Central Europe has been influential in recent years. I was wondering how far the question of resistance to nationalism or indifference, ambivalence about nationalism is an issue for rural parties.
Rural parties, rural politics.
I would have one short question to this networking and what we heard of the importance of communication for transnational networking, and we all heard the Galicians did never participate. Is this a question that they are peripheral? It just takes too long time to network, or just for curiosity, or can this be a factor? How do you need 2 days to travel to Paris at that time, or just to maybe to explain? And for Stefan, for the transnational, I would be interested. We had this American input. If you read the input of Carnegie chairs or anything, is this something which starts at transnational? And they also do a lot of publications on the First World War. If this something like a transnational challenge to all these national document collections, maybe just a few words about this.
¿Otras preguntas? Bueno, creo que hay bastante material, ¿no? Con discutir.
¿Orden de intervención?
Bueno, sí.
Well, thank you very much for very interesting and intriguing questions. Referring to the question about periodization, chronology, and Wilsonite, of course, it is in part a reaction. It is difficult to measure whether it was an explicit reaction or an implicit one. When we look at the sources, and particularly how Wilson was received, obviously one certainly notes that, Wilson seems to feel empty. This empty was the need for legitimization for a progressive-oriented interpretation of self-determination. Thus, I think the mechanism was to silence Bolshevik national self-determination, because for most nationalist parties, or for most activists who actually receive news about what was going on in the Tsarist Empire, this was quite an uncomfortable element, and they prefer to give priority to Wilson. I referred to this shortly in my presentation, because it was a little bit lost in translation, but anyway, for Catalanese elites in 1917, 1918, for Basque elites, or even for Irish elites, etc., it was a matter of, it was an alternative between Wilson and Lenin. And to say Wilson meant implicitly not Lenin. Of course, perhaps I should have more explicitly stressed periodization. As for Job, well, I also mentioned that, there were many connections to diaspora nationalism in the United States. In the case of the Czechs is very well known. I mean, they traveled to America, the Slovak League of America, the Czech League of America. In part of the negotiations took place in America, but also the minor networks established by Catalan Basque activists in exile constantly received funds that were also financially sustained by their American counterparts, by American communities in both North America and South America. And this tendency continued during the 1920s and a part of the 1930s. I mean, to give an example, Catalan exile activists who refer to the Wilsonian principle or to Wilsonianism during the 1920s, during their opposition to the dictatorship of Primo de Rivera, received funding from the Catalanist groups, particularly in Havana and South America, but also New York. And the first draft of a Catalan constitution was written in Havana, in an assembly that took place in Havana, and was extremely influenced not by Catalan nationals, but actually by Cuban nationals. I mean, some of the proposals resemble those of the Cuban Revolutionary Party founded by José Martí at the end of the 90s. Certainly, the transatlantic dimension must be emphasized. One of the founders of the Unión de Nacionalidades, I also mentioned, Jean Cabris, actually received money from America as well. I mean, from American Lithuanians.
I meant particularly for the formulation of the 14 points. Was there any collaboration?
Apparently, there was some collaboration, particularly regarding the point about Poland. I mean, the point about Poland, the weight of the Polish diaspora was very influential. Also, the strategic importance of having Polish soldiers in Poland on their side. And obviously, we may raise the question. I mean, the Irish diaspora was also extremely influential, but the Irish diaspora was not influential enough to move the United States, to move Wilson in the direction of, supporting De Valera's plea at the Versailles Conference. So obviously, more factors were at stake. But in that case, it's quite clear. I mean, there is an old book written by an American diplomatic historian, I think, in the 1960s, which provided a lot of information, which was the role of immigrant communities in the formulation of American foreign policy on the way of the First World War. And you see how Poles were influential. Obviously, Jewish lobbies were influential as well, particularly in the drafting of the minority treaties, while the Irish lobby was not that influential. I mean, because strategic alliance with Great Britain was considered to be far more important.
Anti-Turkish voices,
yeah, I mean, obviously. Stefan?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think, in a way, I was not. In a way, I was not trying to come up with a model or provide a typology, but what I was trying to do is explain why you have a reshaping of national historiographies towards historiographical nationalism. So both Balázs and Stefan are quite right in saying there are many countervailing tendencies. And I could write a separate paper just about the countervailing tendencies to historiographical nationalism. That includes the work of the Carnegie Foundation, that would include many contestations within the historiographies that I was discussing. When I was portraying the kind of British historiography as the kind of model for, or the standard bearer for the liberal national historiography, of course, you also have a variety of other figures in Britain who tell a completely different story. Yes, I mean, the problem with this kind of macro view is that if you want to put forward an argument, then you sort of have to leave things to the sideline, but maybe the written version should include more caveats about that there are kind of other other lines of thought as well. I built them in occasionally, as with Toynbee, etc. But they could be done. It could be done. You know, every case that I mentioned, you could go deeper. So that's quite right. With the Lawrence's question with the Annales, yeah, it's an interesting point. But I do think that if you look at the Annales in the interwar period, they are very much aware about the strengthening of historiographical nationalism. And they specifically set out to counter that. And Strasbourg is important because there is still the German tradition at Strasbourg, which makes them all the more aware of, if you like, the conservatism, the kind of the statism, but also the pitfalls of what is arguably methodologically the greatest innovation to emerge in interwar Germany, Volksgeschichte. You know, the strong kind of racialization or the potential for racialization of that. So they're very much aware of what goes on. They have a kind of international outlook. They're not focused on France. And the influence of Pirenne, again, is overwhelming in kind of making them aware. And Pirenne it's a self-criticism process for Pirenne, because he rewrites his history of Belgium that he starts before the First World War, in the sense of sort of taking out all the references to ethnicities in there. So I think the Annales are a kind of good example of a movement that is trying to counter this move towards the strengthening of historiographical nationalism. But I think that does not mean that they are not also in many ways quite French in their concerns. So yeah, I think yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Miguel, Lorenzo.
Sí, bueno, teño tres preguntas que responderei brevemente. O profesor Trensenil, claro, renunciamos a moitos matices, porque estamos facendo un panorama en 20 minutos. Efectivamente, pois estamos simplificando a realidade, igual que sinalaba eu que os nacionalistas simplifican o mundo rural e a historia, pois eu acabo de facer o mesmo, pero porque non teño máis remedio. Porque é un conxunto moi abigarrado, moi heteroxéneo de forzas, non? Mencionaba Polonia, efectivamente, Polonia é un caso moi interesante, porque Polonia, antes do 18, hai un partido agrario na zona austríaca, hai un partido agrario na zona prusiana e hai conatos cooperativos, ademais, na zona anteriormente zarista. Co cal, cando se xuntan, vese que o contexto legislativo, cultural, etcétera, pois influe moitísimo, non? Sendo teóricamente todos da mesma nación, non? Polaca. Entón, eses matices é os que renunciamos, e, bueno, en algún momento se escribimos un libro de 6.000 páxinas, poderemos incluir todas as peculiaridades, porque tentamos buscar o que hai de común e non tanto as diferencias que efectivamente son fixemos simplificacións case imperdonables, non? Profesor Lersen, sobre a dimensión transnacional, se son os axentes dinamizadores, son localistas, eu penso que non. Vou mencionar tres fontes de transnacionalización. Unha é a emigración, porque hai unha conexión moi forte, no caso galego evidente, non? No caso irlandés tamén, pero no caso polaco tamén, etc. Hai unha conexión evidente entre os emigrados e as súas asociacións e as asociacións agrarias nos países de orixe, eso a primeira. A segunda é que os movementos agrarios de todo tipo están moi atentos ao que se fai noutros países e imitan, por exemplo, formas de loita, como é o caso de Irlanda, que é paradigmático, imítase formas organizativas, por exemplo, a expansión do modelo Raiffeisen de cooperativas, que se vai espallando, non? Dende a súa orixe alemana, e cando un mira a prensa, cando un lea a prensa, por exemplo, agraria en España, pois un ve que os católicos ven perfectamente e póñense como modelo o que se está facendo en Bélxica ou en Alemanha, que Dinamarca sirve de modelo cooperativo para activistas de moi distinta pelaxe ideolóxica, etcétera, etcétera. Por último, hai unha unha coordinación xa obvia e patente, que é para referir aos partidos agrarios a Internacional Verde, que é unha oficiña de coordinación con sede en Praga, que funcionou ata a anexión de Checoslovaquia por Alemanha, que tivo o seu momento de esplendor a finais dos anos 20 e que tentaba poñer en común os partidos agrarios que nalgúns lugares gobernaban e noutros eran parte de gobernos de coalición ou partidos de oposición importantes. Esta oficina funcionou de maneira bastante continuada, cun boletín e con congresos anuais, etcétera, ata que foi xa imposible, ata que a dinámica de expansión dos reximes dictatoriais por Europa arrasou tamén cos partidos agrarios, claro. Por último, referido ao que comentaba o profesor Coll, se entendín ben ao que se refería, non sei se se refería aos partidos agrarios ou política agraria ou political parties, non entendín ben a derradeira frase. Se se refire a partidos agrarios, o que un proceso que se soe dar por unha vía un tanto populista, se queremos, é que os partidos agrarios preséntanse como defensores do campesiñado, pero o campesiñado chega a ser case unha metonimia para toda a nación, porque o campesiñado son a maioría en moitos países e aparte son os mellores, os máis puros. Entón, defendendo o campesiñado, implícitamente defende esa nación. Eso que sucede, por exemplo, co partido croata campesiño de Radić, que acaba sendo case o único partido croata, primeiro dentro da réxime dos Habsburgo e logo na Yugoslavia independente, case o único partido croata que hai é Radić, é o partido de Radić, dos irmáns Radić, que xa, digamos, asume o papel de partido defensor da minoría nacional, simultaneamente. Isto é un caso exagerado, pero a partir desta exaltación do campesiñado como componente fundamental da nación, pois un acaba tendo case dificultades para diferenciar un partido nacionalista e un partido agrario. Afinando, sí que se ve que no partido agrario hai moitos máis, digamos, hai factores que son tan ou máis importantes que o nacional na súa executoria. Pero xa digo que hai un terreo aí de ambigüidade moi evidente.
¿Otras preguntas más?
Yo.
But I was very intrigued by Stefan's response there. Just as a small anecdotal question, as a matter of opinion or interpretation, and then maybe something that has wider implications. We were briefly in the break talking about the man who came to mind, Franz Steinbach, and the idea of a volksgeschichtlichen view on the contested Rhine basin. In the light of the last question and your response to it, would you consider it conceivable that Fèvre's Le Rhin, which is proto-analytic and in its denationalization of the Rhine and seeing it purely as an infrastructural feature in the European landscape, is written against Steinbach and is trying to naturalize the French annexation as just the sort of thing that happens and that Volkshistorikers shouldn't be beefing on and on and on about? That's just, almost an anecdotal. So you were mentioning that maybe the Annales, in being a national, are still serving a French purpose. I was wondering if you could read that into Le Rhin. The second thing is then indeed the longer pre-war and post-war, particularly in the French-German constellation that you highlighted very well about, war guilt and all that sort of stuff. It goes on until the Fischer controversy. It never stops. So this is not
today, Chris Clark is,
absolutely. So it's not just something that is particular of the interbellum or of the post-1918 movement. And also, I was wondering, it goes back to the war propaganda, which in which all these 5,000 professors signed manifestos saying "Es ist nicht wahr." And I'm in particular thinking of a very interesting source collection by Émile Durkheim, Qui a voulu la guerre, which was published in Geneva, I think in 1915, which is already gathering diplomatic evidence to, oppose the idea that the war was forced on Germany and that there was a deliberate war aims going on, trying to actually, scrape together the documentation as a part of war propaganda. So in a way, there seems to be a great continuity from the actual investment in war propaganda to very rarefied historiographical debates to the Fischer controversy. And I was wondering if you could situate what you contextualize as a post-1918 moment in that longitudinal situation.
era la última, ¿no? Creo que sí. Bueno.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting question whether Febvre writes Lerain in response to Steinbach. I don't know. Peter Schöttler did a new edition of Febvre's book a couple of years ago with a huge introduction. So I suspect if we look in there, we might find the answer. But on the top of my head, I don't know. But you know, it is conceivable, yes, absolutely. The wider story, yes, I think there is a wider story there. But I think what is striking about the immediate post-war debate, and you're right that it already starts in the war, that is the immediacy of the political functionalization and the almost the openness on the side of both politicians and historians, that's what they do. And I think there are immediate political repercussions also in the Fischer controversy, but on a much lesser scale. I mean, the German Foreign Office basically takes back money with which he was supposed to go to the United States on a lecture tour. The American universities then step in so that he can still go on this lecture tour because they fund it and not the Foreign Office. So there are kind of political overtures there. But I think the context is quite different because it's no longer about revising or sort of contributing to a politics of revisionism concerning the peace treaty, but it is about longer-term continuities in German history, whether, if you like, the Nazis were an accident in German history, as leading German post-Second World War historians such as Hans Rothfels or Gerhard Ritter claimed. I mean, Ritter basically blamed the Italians and the French Revolution for Hitler, so certainly nothing that happened in Germany. And of course, what Fischer does is he says there is a longer-term continuity here, and Germany had these aggressive intent for a longer period, and that creates the debate in the early 1960s. Plus, it happens in a climate in which there is an increasing public discourse on National Socialism and on the silence about National Socialism in the immediate post-war years. So you have a rediscovery of this topic to which Fischer also contributes. And of course, you know, we saw in 2014 renewed debates about the First World War. We talked about it over dinner, I think, yesterday. You know, the way in which Christopher Clark has been used also in Germany to say, well, at long last, we have an Australian who surely is objective to tell us that Germany was not guilty in the outbreak of the First World War. And, you know, the kind of history politics that is associated with that is also there. But you see that politically there are only faint echoes there, because in a way, the kind of reconciliation of Germany within a kind of wider European history politics is such that the relevance of this question is no longer politically so urgent. I think that this is a very different context in 2014. And although you have the occasional claim still that, you know, Germany plays some kind of sinister role in Europe, you know, from Nicholas Ridley to, I don't know, claims in Greece, or if for that matter, I guess also in Spain over Germany's role in the financial crisis after 2007. There still isn't there, it hasn't got that same political urgency, I would think.
Pues bueno, aquí acabamos. Muchas gracias a todos y nos vemos mañana por la mañana a las 10, ¿no? A las 10 empezamos y descansáis. Va a ser una mañana muy larga.
It's been quite a long day.
Yeah.
And it's going to be.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.